that entered the ancient Christian church, seeking forgiveness for his sins and probably hoping and praying for a victory. But the next day, the assault began, and the Ottomans quickly took Constantinople, thus meeting its end. The Christians bravely defended their city, and Constantine even discarded his royal regalia and died fighting like a soldier. And Islamic law required that soldiers be permitted 3 days of plundering the spoils, but Mehmed was rather reluctant. Eager to spare the city he longed for as his capital. So he limited the plundering to just 1 day, and even so the aftermath was horrible. According to Christian eyewitnesses, the Turkish soldiers paid no heed to others. When they had massacred, there was no longer any resistance. And so they were intent on pillaging, stealing, disrobing, killing, raping, taking captive men, women, and children. And when it's even said that when Mehmed himself entered the city, praying at the Christian altar, he wept at seeing the destruction that had occurred. Now, Constantinople was a Muslim city, capital of the Ottoman Empire. The beautiful Hagia Sophia Christian church became a mosque, and a momentous change had occurred in the relationship between Islam and that of Christendom. And so that battle for Constantinople has a great importance. It opened the way to further expansion into Europe, especially with the siege of Vienna in 1529, or the attempt at that. And this was led by Suleiman the Magnificent, probably one of the greatest Ottoman emperors, even though he's not successful here. It signaled the pinnacle of the Ottoman Empire's power and the maximum extent of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. And it led to about 150 years of bitter military tension, and reciprocal attacks ensued from both sides. Now, the inability of the Ottomans to capture Vienna in 1529, it could be considered what turned the tide against almost a century of conquest throughout Eastern and Central Europe. Let's take a look at their social structures. The Ottoman state and its society rested on many institutions. And in creating these institutions, the Ottomans drew on the experience of earlier Muslim empires, as well as their own Turkish traditions and those Ghazi ideas, the warriors of Islam. Many of these institutions were altered and corrupted over time, and that ultimately was a part of the empire's decline. The Ottomans' ancestors, the 11th century Turkish intruders from Central Asia, brought with them the belief that leadership was a divine right bestowed on a chosen family. And this actually went against the established Islamic practice of elected leadership. This was the model for the selection of Abu Bakr as Islam's first caliph, or even the successor to the Prophet Muhammad. And so Osman and his descendants, or Ottomans, ruled in this unbroken chain until the abolition of the Sultanate by Mustafa Kemal in 1922. That's after World War I. The Ottoman Empire exists all the way until then. Now, there were two other concepts that accompanied Ottoman practices of succession. Ottoman princes were sent off to the provinces, usually with their tutors and their mothers, to learn the business of government and negotiation and leadership skills and military strategies. And the other was that these same princes had to compete for the throne. Potential male heirs fought each other at the time of the death of the reigning sultan, and the victor got the sultanate. The practice developed in such that the sultan would often kill most of the male relatives. Sometimes they left one alive for the purpose of a future successor, and in order to avoid a rivalry within his own family that might endanger his reign. So, after that practice of sending the princes to the provinces ended, the princes were kept in a special place in the palace, where they usually sat idle for most of the time among their women of harems. And as a result, when they came to the throne, they had no practical experience in governing. They had no leadership skills. They had no military strategic training. And so, this lack of leadership became a serious factor in the decline of the empire. In addition to their traditions of family sovereignty, the Ottomans drew strength from their origins as Ghazis. And that Ghazi principle fueled their urge for conquest and then helped them to structure their developing society. So let's talk about these 4 social groupings. First, we have the men of the pen. That would be judges, imams, or prayer leaders, kind of like what you might think of as a clergyman, but not as formal. Other intellectuals, those who are educated. Then we have the men of the sword. This would be the military, the soldiers. Right? The men of negotiations, these are merchants, these are artisans, these are the businessmen. And the men of husbandry, the farmers and the livestock raisers. The life on the frontier was a bit less structured than in the urban centers. We have society divided up into 2 groups, the Askari and the Raya. Now, besides protecting the realm and the Raya, the Askari conquered new territories, and that brought in more Raya and, of course, wealth into the empire. And in the early days, it was even possible for the Raya to cross over and become Askari, usually through outstanding military service. And over time, however, the separation between the Askari and the Raya became more rigid. And the military, like other social groupings within the empire, became stratified, depending on how they functioned within society. And by late in the reign of Solomon the Magnificent, the men of the pen were more like bureaucrats of the empire. And then you still have the judges and the imams, but they made up a completely separate group and became the men of religion. And the men of the pen, the men of religion, and the men of the sword were all classified as Askari. And as such, they were exempt from taxes, and they lived off the wealth of the Raya. And each of the 3 groups had their own educational systems, their own internal practices, their own values. So there really was a place for everyone within Ottoman society. And the Sultan, his function was to keep everyone in their place. But there really, truly was a place for everyone within the empire. The non-Muslims, in classical Islamic tradition, those non-Muslim religious communities that had an accepted written holy book were granted a covenant of protection, known as the Dima. And they were considered to be protected people, the Dhimis. And so in return for that status, they paid a special tax, the jizya. And the Ottomans continued this tradition for quite a while. The 3 leading non-Muslim religious communities, the Jews, the Greek Christians, and even the Armenian church, were established as recognized dhimmi communities within the Ottoman Empire, known as millets. And each millet was headed by its own religious dignitary. For example, a chief rabbi for the Jews and patriarchs for the Greeks and the Armenians. And in this millet system, each community was responsible for allocating and collecting taxes, the educational arrangements for the young, the internal legal matters pertaining to personal status, like marriage and divorce and inheritance. And in pre-modern Middle East, identity was largely based on religion. And so this system functioned well until the European concepts of nationalism and ethnicity filtered into the Ottoman Empire in the second half of the 1800s. Alright, in addition to the millet system and the division between the Askari and the Raya, there were several other elements that constituted the backbone of Ottoman administrative practices and military preparedness. And this was the Timur System, the land survey, the provincial structure, and the janissaries. Once plunder had given way to conquest as the financial engine for the empire, the Ottomans needed a way to compensate many of those askari, right? They had to pay them. And that also guaranteed their future services, right, to administer many of those newly won territories. And so they developed the Timur System. And in this system, an askari was given a share of the agricultural taxes of a designated region, and that was usually several villages. And in return for the military service and assistance in provincial administration, they were also given grants, such as Timurli, and that's Turkish for Timur holders. And like other askari, they were exempt from taxation. Now, the values of the Timurs varied, and the military obligation also varied, and that depended on the income, right? The higher the income, the greater the obligation. And at their best times, the Ottomans were able to put forth hundreds of thousands on the field because they were well compensated for their time. The Timurs set forth an awarded land survey known as the Tahrir. The Tahrir took place when a new area was conquered, and sometimes when there was a change in rain or conditions in an older area that had changed so sufficiently it required a new survey. So a team of officials surveyed and recorded, and this was done by the Sanjak, the administrative division of the province. They wrote down all adult male farmers, the sources of wealth, like the farms, the orchards, the vineyards, mills, farm animals, crops, what they yielded, the taxes paid on those. And since this process involved the calculation of regional land and agricultural taxes, as well as the jizya and other Islamic taxes, the committee was assisted at the scene by a local judge. There's always one there. And 2 registers were compiled from all of this gathered information. One was a detailed register of both the regional taxes levied in the Sanjak and the new Islamic taxes to be imposed. And also recorded were the regulations governing the relationships between the Timur holders and the Raya. The Timur holders could collect no more than the officially mandated taxes and services from the Raya, so they couldn't take advantage of the Raya. And this new regime weighed less heavily on the peasantry than the former Byzantium tax system. Now, a copy of the register was kept by the military commander of the area, and so he knew which Timurs were vacant, due to death in battle or some other circumstance. And they could authorize the grant of vacant Timurs. Increasingly, sons succeeded in their father's Timur holders, and even wives could petition for the Timurs of their dead husbands. And then they would have to find people to do the military obligation, right, associated with the Timur. This system offered 2 major advantages to the Sultan. First, he was able to know how many cavalry he could count on. And second, he was able to have a relatively accurate idea of the empire's income. And this system was exceptionally strong and stable up until the 17th century, when inflation and a series of military losses made the Timurs less desirable. Now, while the Timur system, what you might think of as being similar to Western European feudalism, there are some important differences. Albeit it's quite similar with the lord and the vassal and the fief. But unlike a European feudal lord, the Timur holder did not dispense justice. In Europe, there are scattered kingdoms and principalities, and many people just stayed on their manor. So there was no central government to lay down the law, if you will. The justice was the Sultan's prerogative in the Ottoman Empire. So that European feudalism was a government that was on more of a local or regional level because there was no central government. But in the Ottoman Empire, central government was active. It was crucial. And really, the Timur system, with all its associated paperwork, couldn't have survived without a centralized government to maintain regulations.